So, for our first topic, this past Wednesday, Xi Jinping held a major meeting with U.S. and other Western business leaders, academics, and trade associations in an effort to court investors back to China. This is his first high-profile attempt at courting investors since his meeting with U.S. executives in San Francisco this past November. And as observers have noted, the fact that Xi Jinping himself was present and made this invitation is a signal that the CCP is quite eager to call back international investors, which it lost in an unpredictable and unfriendly business environment. So, Miles, could you talk a bit about this meeting and perhaps more broadly, why have Xi's assurances thus far failed to court international investors back to China?
Well, basically, it's China's own doing. Xi Jinping's meeting with this high-profile delegation really didn't go anywhere. People ask very provocative questions. He gave this hardline answers. And immediately after the meeting, members of the delegation talked to the American media with some kind of anonymity and say, hey, listen, nothing really worked. The business is still terrible in China. That's the conclusion. So you're absolutely right. Xi's assurance failed to convince everybody. Fundamentally, that's because China is a planned economy, not a market economy. What really matters in China is not market forces of supply and demand, but what the CCP wants, what the Chinese Communist Party wants. Well, what the CCP wants are basically two things. One is they want to create the dominance of the state-owned enterprises. In other words, the government-run business must dominate. And secondly, they want to have a global economic and technological dominance. Those are two things that CCP wants. That's the reasons why the foreign investments are gone. Now, in order to reach those two goals, in other words, to create a preeminence of the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, and to realize China's global dominance, and you have to do a whole bunch of things. Number one, you really have to make major policy reprioritization, favoring SOEs over non-state sector and foreign enterprises in critical sectors. So Chinese economy basically consists of three major portions. One is SOE, state-owned enterprise, which is pretty big. And then there's the non-state sectors, the Alibabas, the Tencent. Those are privately run, but of course, in the environment of China, it's all controlled by the government. So it's not really private. There's no private ownership per se, constitutional guaranteed private ownership. You only have non-state sector. And then, of course, the third part of that is foreign enterprises in China. In the last several decades, those sectors are huge. And now Xi Jinping is driving that way. So in this new policy under Xi, SOE absolutely has a favorite treatment. And this basically led to competitive disadvantage for non-state sectors and discouraging foreign investment. Secondly, China has this major industrial policy called Made in China 2025 that aims to make China dominant in global high-tech industries. The focus on domestic companies and technologies in strategic sectors has led to concerns about reduced market access and unfair competition for foreign firms. And the government has enacted a whole bunch of really bad policies that basically scare every foreign investor away. Now, those policies and actions include the following. Number one, they strengthen the regulatory crackdowns. Technology, education, and the finance sectors, in particular, are levied heavy fines. Their operations are restricted. And so the Chinese government has overhauled regulatory framework against those companies, most of them foreign. And of course, China also has enacted and enforced with much more vigor the new data security and the privacy laws. There are basically the draconian cybersecurity law. The other one is called the data security law. Those laws have imposed stringent requirements on data collection, storage, and transfer. These laws have made it more challenging for foreign companies to operate, especially those in tech and data-driven sectors. And also, overall, in the name of national security, China has expanded the definition of national security to include economic, technological, and data elements. The CCP has used national security as the basis to scrutinize and sometimes obstruct foreign investments, particularly in sectors deemed sensitive. Of course, China has this overall approach called the dual circulation strategy. This strategy emphasizes strengthening domestic markets and reducing reliance on international markets. While aiming to make China's economy more self-reliant, it has raised concerns among foreign investors about reduced opportunities in the Chinese market. So that's another factor. Of course, each year, China issued this comprehensive list of areas where the foreign investment were not allowed to go. Normally the list is issued by China's Commission on Development and Reform, 发改委. It's called a negative list. It's a 清单, 负面清单, right? So negative list issued each year aimed at improving the control of the party. They actually stifle foreign investment and restricted it to or prohibited in major areas, particularly in cultural and educational and the technological area. Those were basically restricted to many foreigners. So foreigners basically lost interest in doing that. On top of that, you have this perennial problem of the very weak or even none at all of intellectual property rights enforcement. The IPR is a major issue. There are some improvements, but the enforcement of intellectual property rights and concerns overall is very weak. No foreign company is willing to give up their trade secrets, and that's the problem with China. So overall, you have this driven policy to strengthen the state sector and to make China the global dominant economic and technological sector, and with all kinds of new laws that make China's investment environment very bad. And to quote the former Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Commerce's former remark, China is basically uninvestable. That's why Xi Jinping's sweet talk really failed to convince anybody.
And so who exactly was Xi Jinping meeting with here? And I guess how were these meetings coordinated?
This meeting is coordinated by this major China lobby institution in the United States, led by this gentleman called Steve Orlin. The institution is called the National Committee for U.S.-China Relationship. The CEOs are not many there. There are only about 6 of them in this delegation. There were the CEOs of FedEx, Qualcomm, Blackstone, MGM Resorts, those are casinos in Macau, and Broadcom, and Citadel Securities. That's it. They're handpicked by this U.S. National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, the NCUSCR. The rest of the people in the committee, in the delegation that Xi Jinping met, there were real China brokers. There were the China lobbyists. You look at those people, particularly Steve Orlin and the Harvard professor Graham Allison. They were basically there as if they were for the audition to be chosen to be the next Henry Kissinger. Kissinger was cultivated to be China's primary proxy in the United States, with the exclusive access to the senior leadership. So that's why Kissinger is was very powerful. He passed away, so China is another one.
And Graham Allison is famous for, in particular, a book he wrote on China, The Thucydides Trap, and he has sort of a peculiar view of U.S.-China relations. Could you talk a bit about sort of his view and that argument?
You used the word peculiar. He's very peculiar. He's a peculiar old man from Harvard. His views were so out of date and so sort of old-fashioned. Sometimes I'm almost reluctant to comment on him. The Thucydides trap is based upon a couple of assumptions. Number one, the United States is a power in decline. China is a power that's rising. This is basically the typical Communist Party propaganda line. So Graham Allison used this and to fit into his similarly scholarly formula called the Thucydides trap. Number two is Graham Allison's assumption is that the world's predominant problem is just that, is a problem between China and the United States. So both of them were actually false, which I will explain a little bit later. But overall, this Mr. Allen's views and the particular views of Mr. Orlin and line up very well with Mr. Kissinger's predominant tone and theme throughout the decades. That is, they want to hype the importance of the bilateral relationship between the United States and China. They use phrases like, this is the most important strategic relationship. And the whole way to say this is to promote U.S.-China dichotomy. That is, the world is just the Chinese versus the American government. That's why summits are very important. Those China lobbies, their job is to promote this kind of a senior leadership dialogue. They're called engagement. Secondly, after hyping this the supreme importance of the bilateral relationship as the relationship more important about anything else, they hype the consequences of confronting China. In other words, you cannot really confront China. You got to really be conciliatory to China. They're scared of the United States. So that's the whole thing. Mr. Kissinger constantly talk about the catastrophe of the U.S.-China confrontation. And you read the tweets after the meeting with Xi. Mr. Orlin said the same thing. The United States and China must cooperate. We must, engage. We must be nice to each other. Otherwise, consequences will be unbelievable. To promote this kind of the hype, the dichotomy of China versus the United States, serve basically four goals, in my view. One is to demoralize the Chinese people. You have Xi Jinping meeting with the leading figures from the United States, the leading democracies of the world, to basically elevate the prestige of the CCP leader. You can see they were getting on equal with the most formidable power of the world. Secondly, but I think more importantly, this kind of hype aims to demoralize the U.S. allies, particularly China's neighbors, who were basically bullied by China on a regular basis, by neutralizing the United States by the leader of this group, and then they basically try to demoralize the U.S. allies over there. Three, it serves to isolate the U.S. as the bad guy if the bilateral relationship goes wrong, because the U.S. was the only one to blame. That's basically China's narrative. If you put these two superpowers together, if something goes wrong, of course, it's always the U.S. to blame. We are too hawkish. China basically rely on the United States to change its tone, its attitude toward China. China demands respect, despite the fact that it has done very little to deserve the respect. Number four, lastly, I think this kind of hype really serves to create a permanent class of China lobby at the highest echelons of U.S. government and U.S. society. Many of those guys in this or delegation and this people preceded them, they were just, they were important people, but they're really that important in the United States, in the U.S. context. But then when they go to China, they were granted exclusive access to the Chinese leaders. They were like a lottery winners. They were like they have this palpable glee of triumph every time they showed up in the U.S. An ordinary professor from Harvard who doesn't speak Chinese, who doesn't understand the Chinese people, will be the people's commissar dispatched to the United States to do the Chinese government's bidding. And they were given enormous facade of important preeminence. That's a problem. The fact is, the U.S.-China bilateral relationship, yes, is very important, but it's not really the most important. China needs the United States more than the U.S. needs China. We have to understand that basic reality. The China-U.S. dichotomy is also a false assumption. It's not about China versus the United States alone. It's about China versus the rest of the world. So China not only has a problem with the United States, it has most of the democracies in the world. So this is basically a false assumption. The CCP is not invincible. CCP is not infallible. Quite the contrary. The CCP has weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Now, I said it has weaknesses and vulnerabilities. I'm not saying the CCP is weak and is vulnerable. CCP has some very, very formidable capabilities, but also they do not have some other capabilities that were also very critical. Even within their capabilities, they have vulnerabilities. In many ways, it's structural. Chinese government is a government without much credibility. Its corruption is just absolutely mind-boggling and stupefying. And most importantly, people in China are fed up with CCP. You don't see that on surface, but if you really get in touch with the ethos of Chinese society, you know that Chinese people, they're really, really up to their neck with the CCP. So that's basically they're very, very vulnerable and weak as well. United States is not really intrinsically tied to China. Those people, those lobbyists, make you feel like as if without China we're doomed, and China had the noose on our neck. That's not necessarily the case. Chinese Treasury holds debt. It's about $800 billion. That's a very small fraction of their debt overall. So even if China basically sold all of them, it would have not any major impact on the U.S. economy at all. As a matter of fact, the Chinese economy is in serious trouble, is in dire condition right now for the last couple of years. It has a very little impact on the United States, despite China's holding a hold on many of the critical supply chain. So these two economies will operate on totally different systems. So these systemic differences make United States relatively immune to the China factor. So they have some hold on us, but we have much more impact on them. Having said that, however, I have to say that the harm of China is not the actual strength of the CCP regime, but the destructive virus, the pernicious model of governance the CCP represents, and the CCP is capable of spreading to the rest of the world. The model of governance that CCP represents is something that's based on complete elimination of freedoms, total subjugation of the governed, and with unlimited tyranny of a totalitarian state, enriched and empowered by the benefits of the modern technology, and enriched and empowered by free market and free market system that the CCP does not really deserve. Gentlemen like Mr. Allison and Ms. Orlin, I don't know their motives, but exactly what they have been doing is the consequence is that to spread defeatism in the United States by assuming that CCP is rising, the U.S. is in decline. The U.S. has a lot of problems, but we cannot ignore the inner logic of a nation's power, which rests on freedom, free market, innovation, and limited government. So U.S. is not really in decline in the long term. We're rising through transformation and constant technology and social innovations. On the contrary, China is in decline. It has international isolation. Its economy is imploding, and people are fleeing. The corruption is insurmountable. And in essence, CCP is not only a pariah, but also a joke.
That's very well said. And related to that, our next story, the Boao Forum for the Asia Annual Conference took place in southern China's Henan province this past week. Chinese legislator Cao Leji delivered a keynote speech attempting to highlight the way forward for investment in China, as well as the country's commitments to environmentalism and the PRC's foreign policy strategy. Miles, could you give us the major takeaways from this forum? But before you do, I think for our listeners who may not be familiar, what is the Boao Forum?
Well, the Boao Forum basically is China's idea of the Monroe Doctrine for Asia. China wants to be the hegemon of Asia. So they created this Boao Forum for Asia, BFA for short, more than 20-some years ago. It is totally controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. So what it is, it says even though the chair of the Boao can be anybody. Currently, it's the South Korean diplomat, former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. But the Boao system, Boao institution is the general secretary must be a Chinese official. In other words, the guy who is actually in charge must be a Chinese Communist Party official. And the headquarters of Boao must be inside China permanently. In other words, the chair of Boao board, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, is just a figurehead. And the Boao served 4 major missions. Number one, the predominant one is to keep U.S. influence out of Asia. Number 2 is to isolate the 3 key U.S. treaty allies, mostly Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines in Asia. Number 3 is play other key U.S. partners in Asia, particularly Australia and New Zealand, against the U.S. And number 4 is keep India, a very major country in Asia, out of the leadership role in Asia. So those are basically a Boao. And on top of that, of course, Boao has become the major forum, major venue for the CCP to announce its global initiatives.
What has the role of this forum been in past decades? Has it been successful?
Well, more or less, I think, it's been unnoticed, I would say, by the U.S. mainstream media and also main policy circles, because most of the policies were announced to the world first. But there is a particular angle. That is, I think we have not paid enough attention to what Boao has done in the past. That is, it actually served to consolidate the China-centered sort of orbit in Asia. That is, the Asia is for Asians. That kind of thing, China always tried to focus on that. So they announced this global initiative to a group of Asian countries over there. And deals sometimes were made over there. So, but I think right now, in the last several years, with the CCP having lost its credibility due to its COVID behavior, its stand on Ukraine war, and China is totally on side of Russia, and its regional bullying of its neighbors, you name it, most of the countries, China bully were Asian countries. And of course, China's global initiative are not all benign. China's hacking every country. So that kind of thing obviously is not really that positive. So Boao's role has been diminished gradually over the years. This year, for example, 2024, virtually no heads of states of any significance attended. There are only 4 minor states sent their head of state there: Kazakhstan, Nauru, Dominica, and Sri Lanka. And that's it. Those 4 countries were tiny, and except Kazakhstan, and they're all heavily in China's pockets. Even the CCP leadership knows this. Knowing Boao's growing irrelevance, Xi Jinping chose the China Develop Forum, a new sort of a competition forum in Beijing. So this China Development Forum was held about the same time that Boao conference is going on, but in Beijing. And Xi Jinping himself doesn't even bother to show up. Normally he would show up. This year he's not there. He sent this, nor was China's premier, Li Qiang, the guy who's in charge of economy, was anywhere to be found in Boao. So the gentleman you mentioned earlier, Zhao Leji, is basically the head of a rubber stamp, National People's Congress. He has no real power. He showed up. His message was very blunt and not surprising. His messages include global security. China wants to play a major role in global security. And basically another one is anti-United States hegemony. Is the United States is hegemon. Of course, Asia for Asians. He also warned the danger of decoupling from China without saying who's actually responsible for the companies leaving China, decoupling from China. So all in all, I think the Boao's heydays are over. And but nevertheless, it's actually an indication of China's overall situation.
And is it just merely China's overall situation, or why do you think it is that this forum has lost its relevance?
Well, first of all, because it's become less and less effective. So Xi Jinping almost abandoned it. And if the supreme leader say, that's not important, and it's not important anymore.
For our last story, the Finnish National Bureau of Investigation has claimed that Chinese state-sponsored hackers are responsible for hacking Finland's parliament's information system, pointing to the group APT31, a group of hackers connected with China's Ministry of State Security. And this comes alongside U.S. and British officials filing charges and imposing sanctions under the allegation that Beijing has coordinated a massive cyber espionage campaign targeting millions of political actors, journalists, and private companies over the past 14 years. So, Miles, I'd like to get your thoughts on this, but more broadly, I mean, why is China so intent on cyber espionage and hacking, and how successful are they in these endeavors?
Okay, so this testified to actually 2 things. The one we talked about earlier, that is, this shows that China's aim is not just to subjugate the United States. Its aim is to become a global hegemon. So United States is not only the target, it's a target of a Chinese global assault. on many fronts, right? So the false assumption that the world's predominant problem is China versus the United States, that's just that, it's false. Secondly, you ask a very good question, but sensitive question, that is, why does China collect all this data? Some of them sensitive, some of them kind of mundane, right? Hotel registrations and health, hospital patients' information. Those are critical, but overall, why does the country need this? Well, that has something to do with China's ambition to have a dominance in global technology. Technology is data-driven. It's artificial intelligence-driven. Every new platform of high technology nowadays is based upon the collection of data as complete as possible. China's been doing this for pretty much over 20 years. You can go back. The main incidents that I could document in the last 15 years, for example, you can say, in European Union, China hacked into European Union headquarters, stole a lot of documents, member states, key economic data, personal data, security clearance. That's in 2011. And then China built a African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, for African Union. And that headquarters was hacked from the beginning. So 2012 to 2017, at least that can be documented. This is through the release of Wikipedia, the Julian Assange, not Wikipedia, the WikiLeaks, right? That's basically we knew that in minute detail. China also hacked Canada into the National Research Council in 2014, and then in the United Kingdom, the Chinese hackers were accused of conducting a cyber attack on the British telecom giants and some of the key industry corporations. In 2015, the Chinese hackers attacked the German Chancellor Angela Merkel's office and other German government entities. In India, during the height of the border clash in Ladakh, China hacked India's mainframe servers, and that stole a lot of information. In 2020, the same year, China also hacked into key offices and entities of Australian government. And of course, nowadays, you just mentioned in the beginning of this section that Belgium also reported that China has been hacking the Belgium system, and Finland, of course, the newest member, one of the two newest members of NATO, their system was hacked. So this is this is systemic. The reason why China don't want to collect all the information, build the data for its technological dominance, because as I say, the information collected as complete as possible, and you can build a more accurate, more efficient, more powerful artificial intelligence system.
Well, Miles, I think that's all the time we have for this week. Thanks so much for taking the time, and look forward to doing this again next week.
Thank you very much, and looking forward to seeing you again. Thank you for listening to this episode of China Insider. I'd like to thank my colleague Xian Leary for taking part in this undertaking every week. I'd also like to thank our executive producer, Philip Hegseth, who works tirelessly and professionally behind the scenes for every episode to make sure we deliver the best quality podcast to you, the listeners. If you enjoy the show, please spread the word. For Chinese listeners, please check our monthly review and analysis episode in Chinese. We'll see you next time.